After all, your money is just pocket change. Acting all high and mighty over rent of $1,000 a month. Try stopping the payments then. Both of them looked at me with a triumphant air. With pleasure. Paul and Sean probably thought I would come crying and apologizing. They were surprised by my statement. Really, I'm serious. I'm going to stop paying. Saying that, I left the house. This is how I cut ties with Paul and Sean and their family. My name is Michelle. I am a 47-year-old in my 40s. I married Paul 18 years ago. Paul and I met through a marriage agency. I am plain-looking, short, and was nicknamed Sunfish as a child. I was constantly teased by everyone since I was little. Because of this, I have never been confident about myself. For me, with low self-esteem, marriage was a distant dream. From the beginning, Paul looked down on me. He never treated me to a meal. We often split the bill, and I ended up paying more often than not. Moreover, Paul was divorced with one child. I was marrying for the first time, and my parents were quite opposed to it. However, I had no intention of breaking up with Paul. One day, while on a date, Paul proposed to me. You know, I'm okay with marrying you. I was shocked by his condescending tone, and honestly, it hurt. I had often fantasized about the ideal words and setting for a proposal. I had hoped for kinder words about marriage. Additionally, Paul's son, Sean, who was 14 at the time, did not get along with me at all. I resigned myself to thinking it was just teenage behavior, but to this day, he has never looked me in the eye when speaking. But I didn't mind any of that. I truly believed this marriage was my last chance. Marriage was my aspiration. I was nearing 30 and feeling anxious. I thought if I missed this opportunity, I'd never be able to marry again. So, I went against my parents' wishes and got married. In hindsight, my parents were right. If I had followed their advice, I think I could have avoided such a nightmarish situation. Looking back, this was the gateway to hell. From the first day of marriage, hell had begun. You don't need to quit your job, Paul had said when we got married. I thought he was understanding, but I was wrong. On the first day, Paul shocked me with his demand. You'll pay the rent for this place. What? I didn't understand what Paul was saying at first. So, you'll pay the rent. That's why you work, right? From the way he spoke, I could feel that he had no love for me. His tone made it seem like he saw me not as his wife, but as a cash cow. I had thought of Paul as frugal and prudent for not treating me to meals. But maybe he just wanted to be lazy. Paul always had a condescending attitude towards women. It's no wonder he failed at marriage. He often said things like, "For a woman," or "because you're a woman." Whenever a TV show featured a successful woman, Paul invariably sneered at it. A woman being a doctor? I'd never want to be her patient. Paul only complained when he was drinking. Moreover, he didn't have the courage to say these things directly. So he either muttered to the TV or made sure his comments weren't heard by others. Listening to this always put me in a bad mood and made me lose my appetite. Paul was stingy, always looking for something free. At local festivals, he'd make me stand in line for giveaways of vegetables, for example. When the distribution started, Paul would come, collect vegetables for two, and leave. He also signed up for every possible sample and trial offer. It was always my job to turn down the salespeople and solicitations that followed. Paul loved to make complaints. If there was even a slight issue with a purchase, he would always complain. Paul's complaints weren't loud, he would nitpick and take his time to express his grievances. Once, just because a milk carton was dented, Paul complained at the supermarket for hours, making a female part-timer cry. Eventually, the manager had to deliver new milk to our house. Moreover, the manager brought a gift along. Probably, the manager thought it was worth bringing a gift to escape Paul's complaints. Since that complaint, I have not shopped at that supermarket. I'm too embarrassed to show my face there. Paul's tendency to complain is fully manifested at home as well. This laundry isn't clean, the collar is still dirty. He points out stains on shirts he's worn for years that can't be cleaned anymore. I take the shirt without talking back because if I do, a long lecture awaits me. In addition to that, Paul points out dirt in the corners of the entrance, water stains on the windows, and damp hand towels. My day ends with cleaning up after Paul's complaints. Not only is Paul a complainer, but he is also harsh in his use of people. It's as if he thinks of me as some sort of servant. Since our marriage, any kindness Paul had shown me during our dating days has completely disappeared. While we were dating, I felt his kindness occasionally. But now, there is no restraint in his demands on me. Even in the middle of the night, Paul would send me out to buy alcohol. And if we ran out of snacks, he'd make me prepare more. Even if I was sleeping in the bedroom, he didn't care. He would come into the bedroom after midnight and kick my thigh. Hey, we're out of booze. Go to the store and buy some liquor. Once I went, he would then demand, make some snacks. Because of this, I often went to work sleep-deprived. Paul drinks heavily. Because of this, he often misses work due to hangovers. When he drinks to the point of passing out, he doesn't wake up the next morning. Even on weekdays, he might be passed out. During such times, I would have to call his work and say he couldn't come in due to illness. Once, when I forgot to make the call, Paul interrogated me harshly. Generally speaking, when your husband, me, is sick and lying down, you do nothing to take care of me. Instead, you drag me down. If you're going to be useless, at least don't cause trouble. It's all Paul's own fault for not being able to get up due to a hangover. Yet, he acts as if it's my fault. When Paul is hungover and sleeping, I have to be careful not to make any noise. Once, when I vacuumed while cleaning, he got very angry and made me sit on the floor for 2 hours while he lectured me. Now, when Paul is at home, I clean with a broom. When Paul is at home, he is usually drinking, so the vacuum cleaner is almost never used. Paul's lectures are long. He repeats the same things over and over. At that time, I sat on the floor for about 2 hours, continuously apologizing. I've become worn out by Paul's treatment, and living without upsetting him has become a habit. Paul drinks and always lives lazily. He skillfully uses company policies to take time off. I worried he might have been fired because he hadn't gone to work for a long period. But Paul muttered, "It's parental leave." It was a mystery to me how he could take parental leave for a high school-aged son. But I couldn't pry into it. Anyway, Paul is good at interpreting company systems and policies to his advantage. Paul is self-indulgent, always complaining to others while being lenient on himself. Always finding excuses to skip work. He never does overtime or works on holidays. He uses up all his paid leave. But that doesn't mean he goes on family trips. He mostly just lazes around at home drinking. The most he does on his own is go to a chiropractic. Paul's mantra is, "I married you, after all." Even if I don't complain, when I show dissatisfaction on my face, he invariably says this. Paul seems to quickly notice when I'm dissatisfied. He's very sensitive about being seen in a bad light. It's his way of navigating the world. Sean has a handsome face and is popular among his peers, probably because he looks good. He boasts about being scouted as a model. Like Paul, Sean is also harsh towards me. He absolutely refuses to eat food he dislikes. Moreover, if his disliked food is on the table, he complains. Like Paul, Sean complains persistently and at length. Once, when I handed him socks that were turned inside out after washing, he complained for a week. Sean went to a public middle school and his grades were above average. Paul disliked spending money on anything other than himself, and had no interest in Sean's education. Public high school is enough, he can work after graduation, Paul declared. Thinking about Sean's future, I wanted him to go to college. For that, I wanted to suggest a boarding school. Thinking that it would be difficult for Sean in the future, I decided to send him to a tutoring school. Paul wouldn't pay for it, so I decided to cover the tuition with my income. However, this would make it hard to make ends meet. Paul gave me some money for living expenses from his salary, but honestly, it wasn't enough to live on. I decided to ask for a bit more living expenses. This request came after months of enduring and trying to cut corners wherever possible. Paul snorted coldly and dismissed it. If you can't manage with the living expenses I give, you're a failure as a wife. Figure it out. That was the end of the discussion. I could only hang my head. In the end, I decided to pay for the rent, Sean's tutoring fees, and living expenses out of my own income and savings. Sean began attending tutoring and started studying for exams. Initially, he wasn't keen, but I convinced him of the benefits for college admissions and future job prospects. I introduced him to videos on social media about the boarding school. Furthermore, I managed his study schedule, printed past exam papers, and took care of his health, maintaining frequent communication with his tutor, deciding on a preferred school, and supporting his studies. When the acceptance announcements were made, I went to the high school to check. I felt Sean might not tell me the result. When I saw Sean's examination number on the high school's notice board, I was so relieved that I almost collapsed on the spot. Some people even consoled me, mistaking that he had failed. Thus, Sean was able to attend the boarding school. Since his acceptance, Sean has not said thank you to me once. Sean is not expressive, so I couldn't tell if he was pleased or not. Sean boasted over the phone to a friend about going to the boarding school. Man, I got into a boarding school. Now I don't have to worry about going to a good college. People who have to study for college at a public school are unbelievable. I could hear him bragging in the living room. Although he seemed pleased, his way of expressing joy felt disdainful and condescending, which didn't sit well with me. When I told Paul about the acceptance, the first thing he asked was, "What about the money?" Paul hates spending money on anything other than himself. I told him I would cover everything with my savings and salary, and that I had applied for a scholarship. Hearing this, Paul seemed satisfied and finally said congratulations to Sean. The scholarship was not a grant but a low-interest loan, so I would likely be responsible for the repayment. While enduring these hardships, Sean, thanks to his boarding school, barely made it into a university. After studying at university, Sean said he wanted to study abroad. Honestly, I was scared because money was running low, but thinking of Sean's future, I withdrew my fixed deposit to cover the costs. When I checked Sean's social media during his study abroad, it seemed less like studying and more like a vacation abroad. Around this time, I was consulting with my boss about possibly getting a raise. After graduating, Sean got a job at a decent IT-related company, though not top tier. Even though Sean studied abroad, he returned without any noticeable improvement in other languages. Sean often left the house, leading to many moments when it was just Paul and me, making our home life even more strained. Sean introduced me to the person he planned to marry. She seemed kind and quiet, a lot like me, I felt. I had a bad feeling about this. Could Sean be thinking the same thing as Paul? Maybe Sean found his next cash cow or a candidate for a servant in this woman. That's when Paul declared, "Sean and his wife will live here. You have no place here, Michelle." Sleep in the shed next to the entrance. The moment I heard that conversation, something inside me snapped. Unbelievable. How much do they think I've done for this family? I've worked as they said, paying everything from rent to living expenses to tuition fees. I had hoped for a little gratitude, some recognition. But it was all in vain. Instead, I was told such horrible things. Sean and Paul looked at me, startled. Do you understand why Sean could go to university? Sean smirked awkwardly, trying to evade the question. I directed my anger at Sean. Your father had no intention of sending you to college. I was the one who paid and helped you study to get you into university. I don't know about that. Sean looked down and retorted. Don't start with that now. When did I ever ask to go to college? That's right, no one asked you. You did it because you wanted to. How can you say that? You all just see me as a convenient ATM, don't you? Sean burst out laughing. Now? Really? Sean looked at me with disdain. You're only good for making money and giving it to us, so stop acting all high and mighty. It seemed Sean thoroughly despised me. Enough is enough. Unable to hold back any longer, I kicked the chair away and stood up. Paul put his hand on my shoulder and forced me to sit down. Then he coldly said to me, Hey, Michelle, what are you saying to Sean? Have you fallen so low, not just in looks but in character too? What an awful thing to say. I've endured and endured for 18 years. But I've reached my limit. Enough from you two, don't encourage Sean. I'm not getting carried away. It's just how it is. You're that kind of presence in this house. I was so shocked and angry that tears welled up. Seeing this, Paul and Sean said dismissively. A woman like you, there's no way you're recognized as a proper wife. What are you getting carried away for? Dad's right. Just because you give a little money, don't get all high and mighty. I glared at Sean. If that's what you think, then I no longer need to give you money. Do whatever you want. I'm sick of living with you. Yes, let's cleanly cut our ties then. You both work, so you won't have trouble with money. That's right, we can manage without your money. And I'm getting married anyway. After all, your money is just pocket change. Acting all high and mighty over rent of $1,000 a month. Try stopping the payments then. Both of them looked at me with a triumphant air. With pleasure. Paul and Sean probably thought I would come crying and apologizing. They were surprised by my statement. Really, I'm serious. I'm going to stop paying. A look of surprise and fear appeared on Paul's face. Paul was inherently cowardly and weak. When confronted, he crumbles. Well, good. We don't need you anymore. Understood. I'm happy to let you have your way. I'm leaving this house. I will never involve myself with you again. Saying that, I left the house. This is how I cut ties with Paul and Sean and their family. 3 months later, Paul called me. I was reluctant to answer, fearing he might create trouble later, but I picked up the phone. Michelle? It's me, Paul. His voice was panicked. I stepped away from the phone and took a deep breath. I know. What is it? Help me. I thought they might struggle eventually, but the urgency was extraordinary. What? After all this time? I thought I had cut ties with you. I tried to remain calm despite my heart pounding. Don't say that. Things are really tough right now. So, could you just help with the rent again? We're family, after all. Indeed, we are still in the process of divorcing. Discussions have been unproductive. So I am talking with a lawyer about proceeding with a divorce through the courts. Legally, we are still married, but I see no reason nor have the desire to help this man. What are you talking about? Who was it that said my money was just pocket change? I might have said that, but I'm really in trouble now. Paul's voice started to sound tearful. However, I know this is just an act by Paul. He's trying to worm his way back in. I was wrong before. I apologize, so please help me. Without your help, the family will fall apart. Hearing this, I felt Paul was genuinely in trouble. I responded to Paul with a patronizing tone. Oh, is that so? I heard Sean got fired. And now he's spending his nights at the police station. Sean has been under investigation for embezzling company funds. Paul seemed shocked. He was at a loss for words. After a moment, Paul managed to muster a voice. How do you know that? By the way, did you know Sean's company was recently acquired? The company that bought it is the one I work for. What? A loud thud followed his voice. It seemed Paul had dropped the phone. Paul knew Sean had been arrested, but he was unaware that my company, which manufactures AI semiconductor chips, had acquired Sean's IT company. When we investigated Sean's company, we discovered the embezzlement. And Sean was the perpetrator. Our CEO is strict about ethics and does not tolerate dishonesty. We immediately pressed criminal charges, and most of the involved parties have been arrested. I ended up working for this company because Sean wanted to study abroad. And I had asked for a raise to support him. The person who listened to me at that time was the department head. He was a capable person, involved in several developments that led to patents. He told me he was about to start his own company. He always said he couldn't fully utilize his skills at the current company. That department head invited me to join his new company. It might not pay well at first, but it will surely be successful, he told me enthusiastically. I believed in his potential for success and decided to change jobs without consulting Paul. At that time, I avoided even speaking to Paul. I planned to get by on my savings and 401k for a while as the salary would be lower initially. The new company didn't pay much at first. However, after securing several patents related to AI, our performance soared. The CEO praised me for smoothing operations and advancing development. He often said, I couldn't have focused on development without you. Indeed, the CEO, when focused on development, did not pay much attention to managing the company or sales. I took on the negotiation with banks and the development of new business ventures myself. Being a startup, there was no choice but to do these things ourselves. As development progressed, we expanded the team and the company grew. The company's growth wasn't just due to my efforts but also because of the AI semiconductor developed by the CEO. Although the CEO said my salary would increase, I kept it the same as at my previous company. Because I thought Paul would take advantage of my increased income. Instead, I received shares of the company in lieu of a higher salary. Sean's crime involved colluding with a trading company to inflate bills to our company. The bills were supposedly from a company overseas, making them harder to trace. It seems he had been doing this for at least 2 years. The police are also investigating Sean for other possible crimes. It was surprising that Sean could come up with such a scheme involving an overseas trading company. The trading company claimed they did it reluctantly at Sean's request. I suspected there was a mastermind behind this plot. Although it's just a hunch, I think it might be Paul. You orchestrated Sean's scheme, didn't you? I asked Paul directly. Paul stammered, "What? No way, he did that on his own." Really? He's been doing it for a while, but it's impressive how he didn't get caught. In a way, that's quite a talent. I tried to coax more out of Paul. Well, it's a crime, so it's not good to call it a talent. But using overseas companies was a good idea, maybe. So, you planned it and had Sean execute it. Why would you think that? The part about using overseas companies wasn't reported. You knowing about it means you were involved. That's called revealing a secret. I could hear Paul grinding his teeth. I will report this to the police. I think Sean will talk about it himself, even if I don't say anything. Don't joke. This is all because of you. Paul continued to talk, but I hung up the phone midway. I didn't want to talk to Paul anymore. After that, he called several times, but I ignored all his calls. I understand that Sean's arrest is serious. But Paul also earns money. I wondered why they were struggling so much financially. 3 months later, Paul contacted me again. I had been ignoring him, but I needed to retrieve some items I had left at the house. So I called Paul back. Paul said it was too much to discuss over the phone and wanted to meet. I agreed to visit the house. The next day, I went to the house where I had lived until half a year ago. It was evident the house had deteriorated. Nothing had been maintained. Leaves had accumulated on the pathway to the entrance, and it was stained with water spots. The doorbell didn't ring when I pressed it. Perhaps it was broken. When I grasped the doorknob, the door opened. It wasn't locked. As I stepped into the entrance, a stench hit my nostrils. It was probably the smell of rotting garbage. They hadn't even taken out the trash. I called out loudly for Paul in the entrance. After a while, a raspy voice responded, and the door leading to the living room opened. I recoiled when I saw the man who appeared. The man who emerged was emaciated, his eyes sunken, his hair patchy and stark white. His complexion was unusually yellow. I stared at the man, not recognizing who he was at first. Then the man spoke. It was Paul's voice. "Can a person change this much?" Paul looked at me and his eyes widened. You've changed somehow. Have I? But this house, it's quite run down, isn't it? Paul snorted and returned to the living room. I followed him into the living room. I was shocked by what I saw. Garbage was scattered like mountains. It was more than just a dirty house, it was a garbage house. Paul seemed unconcerned and sat down at the dining table. I tried to sit at the table too, but it was covered with scattered dishes and glasses. Reluctantly, I carried the dirty dishes to the kitchen. The kitchen was filthy too, but I chose to ignore it for now. After clearing up a bit, I sat down at the table. Paul slid an envelope across to me. It was marked with a hospital's logo. Curious, I looked inside and found a medical report. It was Paul's diagnosis. "I've got hepatitis." Paul spoke weakly. He had been drinking heavily every day. I had thought it was only a matter of time before Paul damaged his liver. But so, he had developed alcoholic hepatitis. Now, Paul wouldn't be able to drink anymore. A full recovery might be difficult. I read through the medical report. It also mentioned that he had developed diabetes. I looked intently at Paul. "You've also developed diabetes. With these levels, there's a high chance your liver has cirrhosis. You're well informed." "It's probably cirrhosis." Paul spoke, looking down. "Should you even be here? Aren't you supposed to be in the hospital?" "Well, I wanted to talk to you, so I snuck out." This must be another one of Paul's tactics. He's showing me this filthy house instead of the hospital, trying to garner my sympathy. A petty scheme is apparent in his approach. "You and your son made this house this way, and I don't live here. So, I don't feel sorry at all." Paul's face darkened. "You really have changed. You seem stronger." Failing to elicit my sympathy, now he tries to flatter me? I couldn't gauge Paul's true intentions. Then, Paul began to speak bit by bit about what had happened over the past 3 months. He said that he had been living normally after I left. Sean's fiancée used to come over twice a week to take care of the household chores. However, Sean had a falling out with his fiancée, and they lost contact. Neither Paul nor Sean understood why the contact had suddenly ceased. Of course, they wouldn't. I had contacted the fiancée and strongly advised her to break off her engagement with Sean. She moved out of her place and changed her phone number. Now, she lives in an apartment run by one of my friends. I didn't want Sean's fiancée to walk the same path as me. I met with her several times and carefully explained how terrible Paul and Sean were. Thanks to that, she came to her senses, realized Sean's cruelty, and cut off all contact with him. Pretending to know nothing, I urged Paul to continue. Then, the house quickly became covered in trash. That was to be expected since I had been meticulously cleaning and taking out the trash every day. Paul started coughing heavily. It was a damp, unpleasant cough. I pulled out a mask from my bag and put it on. Then, there was Sean's incident. This too had been uncovered by the investigation my company conducted. Paul's salary was the only source of income left. Still, it seems he couldn't escape his lazy lifestyle. I looked around the room. Empty alcohol bottles and beer cans were scattered throughout the house. One could guess the kind of life that had been led here. In the end, I had stopped making payments. The rent of $1,000 a month must have been weighing heavily on Paul. Paul said with a trembling voice. It's been 3 months since that last call. Why won't you help me? Isn't this too much? Why should I help? Tell me, where's the reason? Aren't we still husband and wife? Sean is in trouble too. Don't you want to help? Paul clearly didn't understand what he had done to me. He remained selfish. No, absolutely. I don't feel like helping even one bit. Paul glared at me but soon looked down, defeated. Then, he looked up at me, pleading from below. Paul's face twisted into a warped smile. Your company has money, right? It even acquired Sean's company. It must be making a lot. So, use that money to help us. I sighed deeply. It's not my money. It's the company's money. You caused this incident because you don't understand the difference between personal and company funds. You should study that a bit more. The family is in trouble. Help us out. We're not a family anymore. You just left the divorce papers I sent you as they were, right? Of course. I never wanted to divorce. I tore them up every time. Michelle looked at Paul coldly. I've consulted with a lawyer, and the divorce has been finalized through the courts. Originally there would be mediation and negotiation. But with the evidence of domestic violence and financial exploitation from Paul and Sean, I was able to take it to a divorce trial. Paul clenched his teeth and continued to look down. I told you we're cutting ties. And you only contact me when you're in trouble. It's too convenient. We've lived together up until now. I was the one who married you. I really hated that attitude. Always looking down on others, but you grovel before anyone stronger than you. You're the worst kind of person. That's too harsh. I'm sick, you know. And it's an incurable disease. You could be a bit kinder. Paul, looking up from below, spoke in a pleading tone. That's not going to happen. You're probably just trying to sweet-talk me into being a transplant donor. But that's not going to happen. Paul's expression faded. Besides, you were arrested by the police and are going to prison. Did you really talk to the police? Paul leaned forward and pointed at me. Of course. From a distance, the sound of a police siren could be heard. I stood up. Paul clutched his head and groaned inaudibly. I've already cut ties with you. I have no intention of helping you. You only act like family when it suits you. No matter how much money trouble you have, no matter how miserable your life becomes. It has nothing to do with me. Go to hell, you piece of trash. I left the garbage-filled house behind. Paul was arrested and received a guilty verdict. He is serving his sentence in a medical prison. According to the lawyer, Paul developed liver cancer from cirrhosis and doesn't have long to live. He'll likely never leave prison again. I want Paul to reflect and atone for his crimes. Sean, during his interrogations, claimed that everything was part of Paul's plan. Sean tried to pin all the blame on Paul. However, there were many contradictions in his testimony, and his lies were quickly exposed. The U.S. police must be quite capable. Given Sean showed no remorse, he received a harsh prison sentence. His appeal was swiftly rejected, and he is now incarcerated. Sean will live but faces a tough life repaying the company and compensation to his fiancée after his release. He'll probably find prison more comfortable. After confronting Paul, I felt as if a weight had been lifted, and I began to live freely. I started going on sales rounds for work, and at the president's suggestion, switched from glasses to contact lenses. Meeting more people made me pay more attention to my appearance. I realized that if I looked sloppy, people treated me accordingly. I began to care more about my clothes and makeup. And even started visiting the cosmetics department at department stores, a place I had previously avoided. Initially intimidated, once I stepped in, I learned not only about makeup but also about speech and posture, realizing the importance of appearance. Since then, I've dedicated more time to grooming. Recently, I've noticed men blushing and looking away when our eyes meet as I walk outside. It's a strange feeling, considering I used to be the one who looked away. Meanwhile, my company has continued to grow, and I was appointed to the board of directors. At a recent executive meeting, the president announced his intention to resign to focus on development. Amidst the commotion, he nominated me as the next president. I was the only one surprised, everyone else congratulated me. Since then, my days have been busy with unfamiliar tasks. But they are incomparably more fulfilling than before. Thus, I have regained confidence in myself and am enjoying life.